Hey everyone, the original video ended up being over an hour long, and since nobody has that kind of time, I have split it into a few parts. I hope you enjoy them.
Hello fellow readers and readresses. Today we're gonna do a bit of a different video. I have spoken ad nauseum at this point about the obscene amount of series I am currently reading, or rather kinda half stuck in progress. Seriously, it's over 70 as of right now, and not only is this number comically large, it is also completely ridiculous and unsustainable. So I put it as a goal for myself for 2024 to reduce this number to 20, and the first step of this goal is to actually go ahead and DNF all the series I am not interested in reading, which is a lot of them. So this is exactly what we're gonna do today. We're gonna go through all the series I currently have ongoing, and we're gonna start DNFing with the big axe. It's gonna be a massacre, I think, I hope, I don't know. We have a lot of series to go through, so let's get into it.
Okay, I am shooting this portion of the video on the 25th of December because I didn't have the opportunity to actually film the whole thing together. I filmed the intro and the outro like a week ago, and now I'm finally having a little bit of time to film this part, and I'm excited because I've been wanting to do this for quite some time now. Anyway, let's get into the series and start DNFing. Now, what you're seeing on your screen right now is my reading diary digital table, which is basically a spreadsheet which I have utilized with a bunch of formulas to kind of semi-automate my reading stats and records. We are currently on the series sheet, which shows you every single series that I've started and that I've finished. We have 14 series that were completed by me and 92 that are currently in progress. Now, mind you, I have reset everything that I had DNF'd previously. I did that like a few months ago because I wanted a clean slate when I start DNFing this time. Anyway, enough preamble. Let's get through the series one by one. We're gonna start with The Hunger Games, which is a young adult dystopian science fiction series that everybody is familiar with. I read the first book years ago, but I only managed to finish it recently, and I absolutely loved it. We continue with The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This is an adult epic fantasy series, and it currently has 4 main novels that were published and 2 novellas. We are expecting the last book from the first arc of the series to be published in 2024, and after that, in the future, we are expecting 5 more books to complete the second arc of the series. I love the series. It's one of my favorite ones. It has gotten me through some of the hardest times in my life, and I will forever be thankful for that. Obviously, I'm going to continue with it. Next, we have Wraith Kings, or Wraith Kings. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. This is an adult fantasy romance series by the author Grace Draven, and I'm almost entirely sure that it's self-published. I read the first book from the series years back, and I loved it, and I reread it recently and still loved it. I wasn't planning on continuing with it up until recently, but upon rereading the first book, I realized that I actually love this world and I love these characters, so I'm gonna continue with it. This series is kind of strangers to lovers to friends, and I will highly recommend it to every one of you who's into romance or fantasy romance. Next, we have Shadow of the Fox by Julie Kagawa. This is a young adult fantasy romance that is based on Japanese folklore as far as I remember, and it's really nice. I made a mistake by reading all 3 books back to back because they're written in such an episodic way. There's a lot of things happening, and every single chapter pretty much brings you a new adventure, so I needed to take a little bit of breaks between the books because by the last book I was already tired of all the monsters and all the new things that the story brought to us. But as a whole, I think it's a very nice story. It's very sweet and it's a fun time. Next, we have Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. This is a young adult science fiction series, and I quite enjoy it. I read the first book Skyward years back, and I read Star's Hide this year and loved it. I can't wait to continue with it. Next, we have An Ember in the Ashes, and this is gonna be the first big question to myself, what to do with this series, because I read An Ember in the Ashes I think in 2019 for the first time and loved it, and then I reread it, and then I think I reread it again, and all 3 times I loved it. And then I read A Torch Against the Night, and while I liked how it started, I didn't like how it progressed, and by the 3rd book, A Reaper at the Gates, I was already fed up with this story, and not so much with the story, but by the way the author, Sabaa Tahir, is developing the action and the plot and the characters, and so I am going to DNF it because I DNF'd A Reaper at the Gates like 3-4 months ago, I think. Still, I don't want you to get me wrong, this is not a bad series. I still recommend it to people because I think it's just a personal thing how I prefer the action to be developed. It's just not a match, but I think if you're interested in deserts, in the Roman Empire, in Middle Eastern mythology, I think this could be for you. Book of the Ancestor by Mark Lawrence. This was a trilogy that I read a few years back, Red Sister, Grey Sister, and Holy Sister, and is one of my favorite ones, and I still recommend it to people. I'm starting to realize that it's not to everyone's taste, but I find it very, very interesting. It's an adult fantasy, kind of science fiction in my opinion, because there are some science fiction elements. So I think it's very nice, so I'll recommend it. And as a whole, I had a great time and I really like the author's writing. We have Hercule Poirot by Agatha Christie. This is an adult series of mystery companion novels where the main character is the detective Hercule Poirot, and I really, really love it. I enjoy reading every single one of these books. They're usually very short, the mystery is top-notch, and I am planning to go through every single book of this series, and as you can see here, it's gonna be a long time before I finish it. This next series is in Bulgarian, but the title is The Shadows of Atlantis, and it's a young adult fantasy, and I didn't like it, to be honest with you. I only read the first book, Between Dreams or something like that. It's a word that has no literal translation, and it was written so poorly. Oh my god, I think the author was not even 20 when she wrote it, and I don't mean to imply that younger people have no style or any of that, but this particular author didn't do a good job. The action didn't make sense, the descriptions didn't make sense, the character didn't make sense. All of it was written very, very poorly, and I'm definitely DNFing this. Next we have Jurassic Park. I read the first book, Jurassic Park, 2-3 years ago, and I really, really liked it, and it's so funny that I never read it before, but I had a good time with it, and I've heard that the second book, The Lost World, is not as good as the first one, but I do like Michael Crichton's writing, so I'm definitely going to continue with the series. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. I marked it here as a quartet because I count The Hobbit as part of the series, and I read all 4 books and I loved it. The Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells. This is an adult science fiction series, and the first few books are novellas as far as I remember. I read the first 2 of those and I liked them well enough. I wouldn't call them masterpieces or anything like that, but they were interesting. I liked the characters that were included. I like Murderbot as a character archetype, so to speak, so I'm gonna continue with the series. It's been a while since I read those though, so maybe I will have to reread them. Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This is an adult fantasy series that currently only has 1 book, and I think 1 short story and 1 novella, and I read all of them and I liked them, and as soon as the author continues with this series, I will continue reading it. Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. This is a young adult fantasy trilogy, and I think everybody is pretty much at this point familiar with it. It also goes by the Grisha trilogy. I read it a few years ago. It wasn't anything spectacular, but I did like it, and it's the series that introduced me to Leigh Bardugo's writing, which I really, really like. Gentleman Bastard by Scott Lynch. This is an adult fantasy series, and I read the first book, The Lies of Locke Lamora, a few years ago and really, really loved it. And then this year, I continued with the series by reading Red Seas Under Red Skies, and I was somewhat disappointed, and by somewhat, I mean quite. The structure of the story was all over the place. The character motivations were also quite messy. The whole progression of the plot wasn't done great, and I feel as though the author had tried to write 2 different books and then merge them into one. Again, I was underwhelmed and disappointed, but I am going to continue with the series in the hopes that the next book is going to be better. Lawful Times by Daniel B. Green. Daniel Green is a very famous booktuber actually, and I really like watching his videos, and this is how I found out about his books, which he self-publishes. The first book from this series, Breach of Peace, is a novella that I read a few years ago and really, really liked, even though I had issues with the writing style, but I just really loved the story. And then the second book, Rebel's Creed, I read this year, and same thing. Great, interesting story. Very bad writing style. He really needs to work on his craft. He didn't develop his plot properly. He didn't develop his characters properly. There were a lot of mistakes. So I'm going to continue with the series because I'm curious to know what's going to happen. But so far, we only have 2 books that were published. I have put 3 here so that the series doesn't appear completed, although I think I'm just going to change it to 2, at least for the time being. The Mortal Instruments by Cassandra Clare. This is a young adult fantasy series, urban fantasy series, and it's very, very popular. And I read the first book, City of Bones, 2 or 3 years ago, and it was okay. I gave it, I think, 3 stars. It wasn't anything spectacular, but I think I'm not going to continue with the series because I started reading it for the first time when I was in my mid-30s already, and therefore I can't relate to these characters and to the things they go through. I believe had I read it when I was a teenager or in my 20s, I would have been able to get more out of this story, and I would have probably probably loved it, but at this point there's nothing for me in this series, so I'm gonna DNF. The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. I don't think this needs an introduction, but on the off chance that you haven't heard of it, it's an adult fantasy series that is similar in the beginning to The Lord of the Rings. It is beloved by many, many people, and I started reading it a few years back. I don't think I read a single book from the series in 2023, but I loved the first book, The Eye of the World, and then the second one, The Great Hunt. I enjoyed quite a bit. I think I might have liked it more than the first one, but then the third one, The Dragon Reborn, really disappointed me. I was just infuriated by some of the characters and some of the relationship developments that the author has created, and the plot generally was really repetitive and I didn't enjoy it. But I'm going to continue with the series because on paper it is exactly what I like and I should be loving it. And I was thinking that maybe I should just reread the first 3 books and then try to read the books from this series closer together so that I can get the most out of it, but we'll see. For now it stays. Red Rising Saga by Pierce Brown, if I'm not mistaken. This is a young adult or adult sci-fi series, I'm not entirely sure. I read the first book, Red Rising, a few years ago, and I quite enjoyed it. It wasn't what I expected. It's kind of like the Roman Empire in space, which is a very interesting concept, and I had a good time with it, but I haven't picked a single book since then from this series, so if I want to continue with it, I will have to reread it. So for now, it's gonna stay. I am interested in continuing because the premise of the whole thing is really up my alley. Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is a series that is actually compiled of 2 mini-series. We have Mistborn Era 1 and Mistborn Era 2. The total of those books is 7, and I have read every single one of them, and I really enjoyed it. And when Era 3 gets published, I will read that as well. The Lunar Chronicles by Marisa Meyer. This is a young adult fantasy series and is comprised of 4 main books, each of which is a sci-fi retelling of famous fairy tales. The first one was Cinder, which is telling the story of Cinderella, and then we have Scarlet, which is telling the story of the Red Riding Hood, and then we have Cress, which is telling the story of Rapunzel, and then the 4th one is called Winter, and it's telling the story of Snow White, but they're all intertwined, and the story is very fun. I really enjoyed this series, and I highly recommend it. The Witcher by Andrzej Sapkowski, another very popular series. I read the first 2 books from the series, which both of them are compilations of short stories, and I enjoyed them well enough. They weren't anything spectacular in my opinion, and mostly I had an issue with the writing style, and I think that's because it's a translated work, and when you have a translation, there's always something lost in that translation. But either way, I'm going to continue with the series. I'm looking forward to starting to read the actual full novels from this series. Little House by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is a series of middle grade historical fiction stories that are based on the life of the author, and I absolutely adore these books. I read the first 3, Little House in the Big Woods, Farm Boy, and Little House in the Prairie, and I had such a great time with all 3 of them. Telling the historical reality through the eyes of a child is such an amazing thing. I always enjoyed this style of writing, and while historical reality is harsher to some people than to others, and I understand that some people might find the content of these books offensive, and if that is the case, that is your right. I personally try to look past those things whilst acknowledging that there were clear victims in these situations and focus on the intention of the author and the context of the times when she wrote these books. So I'm going to continue with the series. The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. This is an adult urban fantasy series, and I really like it. I read the first 3 books from the series and absolutely love them. I think the character of Harry Dresden is very easy to relate to and very easy to like, and I like to read those books kind of like palate cleansers between bigger, more epic books, even though the stories within those books are also very interesting. 100 Kingdoms. This is a young adult fantasy duet. Is it what it's supposed to be called? I don't know if duology or duet is the right word anymore. I use duology usually. But anyway, there are 2 books in this series. The first one is To Kill a Kingdom, and I read it. It was a kind of like a loose retelling of The Little Mermaid, and it was okay, but it wasn't anything spectacular in my opinion, and I lost interest and pretty much forgot what I read almost as soon as I closed the book, so I'm not going to continue with the series. There's no point in my opinion to invest my time in it. Dune by Frank Herbert. This is a series of adult science fiction novels, very heavy, very philosophical ones, and I'm gonna probably anger some people by DNFing it outright because I read Dune, the first book, a few years back, 2 years I think, and I loved it. it made me think, and it did to me exactly what I want books from this caliber to do to me. But I got all I wanted from it, and I've heard that the rest of the books aren't as great, so I'm not gonna continue in the series. Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. This is a young adult to new adult fantasy duology, and I really liked it. It is set in the world of Shadow and Bone, but in a different city, and the characters of this duology are its best feature, and I highly recommend it. Pippi Longstocking by Astrid Lindgren. I hope I'm pronouncing the author's name correctly. I read Pippi Longstocking back when I was a kid like 100 times, and I reread it a few years ago, and I found myself slightly annoyed by Pippi because, you know, I'm looking with the eyes of an adult right now at this child that's messing things around, and I'm like, who's taking care of this kid? You know, old people things. So I enjoyed it still, but I'm gonna DNF the series. I don't think I can get anything more from it.